In my last video, I stated that I believe we are not living in the last days. I tried to make a case for the preterist interpretation of end times prophecies, which is the view that all biblical end times prophecies were entirely fulfilled in the events surrounding the destruction of Old Covenant Jerusalem and the Jewish temple in AD 70. I pointed out that in Luke chapter 21 verse 8, Jesus told the disciples not to listen to or make premature declarations that the time of the end was near. And in light of this, I demonstrated that in Luke 21 and Matthew 24, Jesus was basically telling the disciples that only after they had seen and experienced all the calamities he predicted, such as wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, plagues and famines and heavy persecution, and when there had been a falling away, and when they had seen the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, only then could the disciples know for sure that the time of the end was truly near. Only after those things had begun to take place would they be allowed to declare that the end was near. In other words, Jesus was telling the disciples in Luke chapter 21 verse 8 that any declarations that the time was near before they had personally witnessed the unfolding of those predictions would be premature. And Christ was warning them not to listen to those premature declarations. This entire discussion Jesus had with his disciples in Luke chapter 21 was around the year AD 30, just before his crucifixion and resurrection. I also demonstrated in my previous video that towards the end of the apostolic age, approximately 32 to 35 years after Jesus had that discussion with his disciples, the apostles all began to declare that the time was now near. For example, in 1 Peter 4:7, Peter said, "The end of all things is near." In 1 John 2:18, John said, "It is the last hour." And in James 5:8 through 9, the apostle James said, "The coming of the Lord is near, and the judge is standing right at the door." I also pointed out that Jesus himself declared in Revelation chapter 1 verse 3 and Revelation chapter 22 verse 10 that the time was now near. Well, that can only mean that at some point between AD 30 and AD 62, the apostles had personally witnessed the transpiring of every sign Jesus gave in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. Now, while even a simple reading of Matthew 24 and Luke 21 in their proper context should naturally lead any student of the Bible to conclude that those events were to be in connection with a judgment against Old Covenant Israel and had to be fulfilled in the first century generation, one verse that is the source of much confusion and naturally leads the reader to doubt the preterist interpretation is Matthew chapter 24 verse 30, which tells us that at the appearing of Christ coming on the clouds, all the tribes of the earth would mourn. This, of course, sounds like a global event, not just something local to Jerusalem, and not just something that the apostate Jews who rejected and crucified Jesus Christ would mourn. But as is often the case, a deeper look at the original Greek language in which the New Testament was written in gives clarity to the verse and supports the preterist understanding. Now, if you look at the screen, I have Matthew chapter 24, verse 30 pulled up. And I want to take a look at two words in the original Greek language that they were written in. If I click on the word earth, you will notice on the bottom left part of the screen, it brings up the Greek word ge. And if I scroll down, you can see that there are two definitions for this word. One, sometimes it really does refer to the earth or the world as the globe. But it also has a second definition. It sometimes refers to land, as in the land of Israel. For example, if I if you look on the right side of the screen, you can see that this Greek word ge is found in 223 verses throughout the New Testament. If I click on this, it brings up that whole list of every instance where the Greek word ge is used in the New Testament. And notice that in Matthew chapter 2, verse 6, it refers to the land of Judah. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. And then in Matthew chapter 2, verse 20, you can see that it refers to the land of Israel. And in the next verse, in Matthew chapter 2, verse 21, again, it refers to the land of Israel. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 15, it refers to the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. I go to that verse in Matthew 4, verse 15, and I click on land. You see it brings up that same Greek word ge on the bottom left side of the screen. And so the Greek word ge, when it occurs in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, it doesn't necessarily refer to the earth as a globe. Now, secondly, when I go back to Matthew 24:30, if I click on the other word, tribes, you can see on the bottom left side of the screen, it brings up the Greek word phule. This word is found in 23 verses in the New Testament. And when I bring up this list of every instance where it occurs, you can see that many times, probably the majority of the times in the New Testament, it refers to the tribes of Israel. Such is the case in Matthew chapter 19, verse 28. You can see it refers to the 12 tribes of Israel. In Luke chapter 2, verse 36, it refers to the tribe of Asher. It says, "And there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher." And in Luke chapter 22, verse 30, it refers to the tribes of Israel. In Acts chapter 13, verse 21, it refers to the tribe of Benjamin. And so in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, there's no reason to doubt that could be referring to the tribes of the land of Israel. Now, this idea of the tribes mourning, the tribes of the earth or the tribes of the land mourning at the return of Christ, is also found in Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. Where it says, "Behold, he is coming with the clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him. So it is to be, Amen." Again, when I click on that word earth, you see it brings up the Greek word ge. And when I click on the word tribes, it brings up the Greek word phule. That could very well be referring to the 12 tribes of the land of Israel. As a matter of fact, this translation that I'm showing you right now is the NASB translation of the Bible. But if I click out of here and I move over to the Young's literal translation of the Bible, when I bring up Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, notice that it renders that Greek word ge as land, not earth. It says, lo, he doth come with the clouds, and see him shall every eye, even those who did pierce him, and wail because of him shall all the tribes of the land. Yes, amen. Now, notice also, if I click out of here and go back to the NASB translation, in support of the view, in support of the understanding that the return of Christ was to be in judgment and wrath against Old Covenant Israel, let me turn your attention to Matthew chapter 21, verse 33 and following, where Jesus gave a parable about the landowner. Jesus said, listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a winepress in it and built a tower and rented it out to vine growers and went on a journey. When the harvest time approached, he sent his slaves to the vine growers to receive his produce. The vine growers took the slaves and beat one and killed another and stoned a third. Again, he sent another group of slaves, larger than the first, and they did the same thing to them. But afterward he sent his son to them, saying, they will respect my son. But when the vine growers saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him and seize his inheritance. They took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those vine growers? They said to him, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end, and will rent out the vineyard to other vine growers who will pay him the proceeds at the proper seasons. Jesus said to them, did you never read in the scriptures, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing the fruit of it. And he who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, but on whomever it falls, it will scatter him like dust. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they understood that he was speaking about them. When they sought to seize him, they feared the people because they considered him to be a prophet. So the idea in this parable is that the return of Christ would be in wrath and judgment against Old Covenant apostate Israel. It would be against the unbelieving Jews who rejected him as the Messiah, and when they wanted Pilate to crucify him, and yet Pilate wanted to let Jesus go, they shouted back at Pilate, crucify him, and let his blood be upon our heads and on our children. And so the parable of Matthew 21, verse 33 and following tells us that the return of Christ would be in wrath against the unbelieving Jews who had Jesus murdered, and who also went after and killed his holy apostles during the apostolic age. Now, one other passage I want to bring up, going back to the idea of all the tribes of the earth or the land mourning at the return of Christ, when Christ would appear coming in the clouds. That idea actually is presented in the Old Testament book of Zechariah in chapter 12. If I bring up Zechariah chapter 12, verse 11, it says, In that day there will be great mourning in Jerusalem, like the mourning of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land will mourn, every family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Levi by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the Shimeites by itself, and their wives by themselves, all the families that remain, every family by itself, and their wives by themselves. Now this prophecy in Zechariah is the same prophecy. It's talking about the same end times events that are found in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, and Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. And here in Zechariah 12, it is clearly talking about a mourning in the land of Israel, in Jerusalem. Notice also that when I click on the word land in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 12, it brings up on the bottom left side of the screen, the Hebrew word eretz. And just as is the case with the Greek word geh, which sometimes refers to the earth and sometimes refers to just land, as in the land of Israel, so also the Hebrew word eretz sometimes refers to the land, as in the land of Israel, or sometimes it refers to the earth. Many times in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word eretz is referring to the land of Israel, or the land of Benjamin, or the land of Naphtali, or the land of Zebulun, and so on. It refers to the land of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so, in light of these things, there's no reason to doubt the credibility of the preterist understanding of end times prophecies just because of Matthew 24, verse 30 and Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. Those verses fit perfectly with the preterist interpretation, because when we consider the context of Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 21, with the fact that the Greek word for earth is also used to refer to land, as in the land of Israel, and when we conflate these things with Jesus' parable of the landowner in Matthew chapter 21, verse 33 and following, it just makes more sense to understand Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, and Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, as referring to the 12 tribes of Israel mourning when they realized at Christ's coming in judgment that the one who they had rejected and crucified really was the Son of God and the Messiah. And so, I hope this helps.